Hello everyone, welcome back to AppDev channel. In today's video, we will try to implement what we have learned so far in the last two videos about JWT based authorization technique. How to secure the Spring Boot microservices using JWT based authorization. That's what we are going to implement in today's video with live example. Okay. In the last video, we have seen this website, right? jwt.io, where you are having where we are generating the JSON web token by changing this one payload or the header, and we are passing a secret, and we are having an algorithm SHA-256, and we are generating a JWT token, right? So we are having couple of APIs or the libraries to generate or to simulate what it is being done in this website by using libraries, some JWT related libraries. We can try to generate the token for our data. Okay, so let's start implementing that. So these are the different steps I'm going to do today. First of all, we will start with develop a microservice, and we will enable then the Spring Security and the JPA. JPA we will use for authenticating the microservice. This is all we have seen in the last authentication by using the user detail service. That's all we are going to repeat it today, so that we are starting from scratch, so that the users who are seeing this video, they will be going through the authentication technique as well by using the user details JPA service. And then we will try to add the JWT capabilities to our project. Then we will try to generate the JWT token upon successful login, and we will try to authorize the microservices using JWT. Okay, these are the different steps which we are going to perform today. So let's start with by creating a new Spring Boot starter project. I'm going to name it as group com.appdev artifact. I'm going to use Java 8. My application name is authorization JWT 2. Okay, that is my application name, and the same application name I'm going to give it here. Instead of example, let me have this as fdev. Instead of demo, let me have this as security. Okay, so let me create this. I'm going to have initially only the web dependency. So this is creating a project for me. So we have to create a microservice, right? So in order to create the microservice, let me, in the earlier authentication example, we have seen that, right? We have created an employee controller. That employee controller will be having all these endpoints like wish, fetch all employee details, fetch by ID employee, all these things it is having, right? So let me copy this and use it as a microservice here in today's project as well. Okay, the moment I copy, it may require some dependencies, right? Employee service, let me copy the employee service as well. So this employee service will try to give the employee details. So let me give the employee bean as well from there to today's project. So that's all. Okay, so we are done with developing a microservice, I guess. So let me restart this. Let me run this project and see whether it is working fine or not. Okay, container started up. Let me use this. Okay, let me http://localhost 8080/employee/fetch all, right? So this is giving me the employee details, John and Ram, right? Yeah. If I try to search with one, then it is giving me, why it is giving me the error? Employee slash fetch by ID. I have to try. Yeah. If I try to hit the wish service, so all these microservice endpoints are working fine now. So we are done with we know this, right? This is a straightaway development. We are just exposing some methods as get methods by using some request mapping, and those methods we are calling employee service. This employee service is having the data to return the list of employees and return the one employee details, and those we are invoking it from here. Okay, so that's all. We are done with the first step. Let's go to the second one, enable string security and JPA. Okay, now let me go to the other application, form.xml. This is the other application from form.xml, right? Let me copy Spring Boot starter security and the data JPA and the MySQL, because MySQL is the one where I am having all the user details and their passwords, right? So I have to have them. Instead for using JPA based authentication technique, I have to have the data JPA and the MySQL dependencies in my project. Okay, now what I have to do, I have added the enable, I have added the security dependency and the JPA and the MySQL dependencies, right? Now I have to configure the security for my application, right? So that I'll configure the authentication as well. So we are going to create a class app security configurer or configuration, whatever it is. Okay, configurer. Okay, app security configurer. So we have to extend it from web security configurer adapter, right? Because this is the one which is having access to authentication manager. That authentication manager, it manages all your authentication technique to your microservices. So we have to override this method. Okay, so in order to use the JPA based technique for authenticating your microservices, what we have to have the user details service, right? So auth dot user details. So this is the method we have to use, and we have to pass the instance of user details service to this, right? Right. So I have to auto-wire that user details service. Okay. That's all. So we have to write a class now that is implementing from this user details service. Okay. Now let me write a class as my app user details, and that will be implemented from user details service. The moment I try to implement, I have to override the method that is there in that interface, right? So what is that method? Load user by username. So username will be coming up from the user, the login form. So I have to use that username and go to the database and get the user details like username, password, and everything, right? So what I have to do, I have to create a repository to get the data from the database, and that repository should be having an access to an entity. that is referring to a table, right? So let me create a table, let me create an entity class as app user. Okay, and this will be annotated with that entity, and this will be having a name. I mean, this will be referring to a table as user. Okay, app user is an entity that is referring to the table user. Okay, now let me write down the properties which are mapping to the columns of that user table. Okay, private int id. Okay, private string username is there in the table. Private string password is also there in that table. Private boolean, whether the user is active or not, that is also there in the table. And id will be annotated with that id, and also at column, because we are having a mapping as username, user underscore id, right? And this is an auto generation, so we have to use the generated value. Strategy we have to mention as identity. Okay, that's all. Now let me add the constructor and the getter and setters for this entity properties. Generate constructor, generate constructor using fields, also generate getters and setters. Okay, so this app user will be having the relation with user table in our database, right? So let me open that user table as well. Okay, now what I have to do, I have to get those user details by using a repository, right? Let me create a user repository as well. User repository. This will be implemented from the JPA repository, right? Extends, instead of class I have to write interface, right? The implementation will be provided by the JPA. Extends JPA repository, right? Here I have to use the app user, because that is what the entity it has to get the data, right? And the primary key ID type I have to mention repository. And here I'll be having a method find by username. What it has to return? It has to return app user. That's all. Okay. So I have to use that repository now here in my user details service. User repository, and it will be auto while I have to use that user repository dot find by username, and I have to pass the username to it. So what it returns? It returns the app user, right? But I have to return the user details, and this user details of type ORG Spring Framework Security Core user details, right? So how can I convert it now from user details, I mean the app user, to the user details? Because there is a class that is implemented from user details, that is user. Okay, this class is from user details user. If you pass username and password and the list of roles to it, we can directly return the user details indirectly. Okay, so from where we are getting username password from this method into app user instance, right? So let me use that app user here, app user dot get username, app user dot get password, and list of rows. We are not going to deal with any rows in this example like in our earlier examples, right? So I'm going to mention it as empty rows. So I have to return this user object. So this user, if you look at this user, this is actually implementing from the user details. See this user details, that's why it is being accepted here to return it instead of user details. So that's all. We are getting the user details now. Okay, and this user details will be given to this service authentication manager, and authentication manager will give it to the Spring Security. Security, what it will do, it will try to authenticate the user and create the session in the Spring Security, and also put the data upon successful authentication, right? Put the data into security context. So subsequent request, it will not try to give the login form again until that the session is active. So all the subsequent requests will be using that session, and subsequent requests will be served from this Spring server, Spring Security. Okay, so now let's run this application. There is a problem. Yeah, we have to mention the database properties, right? Let me give the database properties here as well. Let me restart it. So what we have done in this step, we have enabled the security and we have enabled the authentication, JPA based authentication to our microservices, right? So application is started up fine. Now let me copy this wish service and let me go here and let me hit this. See, the moment I hit wish service, it is taking me to the login page. But ideally, we don't want the wish service to be redirected to the login page, right? That's okay. For now, uh, let's log in, okay, with whatever user we have in the database, admin1, right? Admin1, user1, they are there in the database. If you look at this, so here there is a problem with bad credentials because we have not mentioned the password encoder. Okay, in security configuration, okay, let me go there and add the password encoder as well. Public password encoder, get password encoder, return no password encoder dot get instance, and we have to annotate this with that bean because this will be acting as a bean, right, in the container, so that that particular password encoder will be used during the authentication. These are the users, right, which we have created earlier with user1 and admin1. Yep. Now let me hit that URL again. And now let me hit that fetch all service. Okay. Admin1 password. Still it is giving the bad credentials error. Yep. because I have to annotate this with at enable web security. Let me restart this. Now it is complaining about some circular dependencies, right? App security configurer depending on user details service. So this service I think I have not annotated with the where is the user details service? My app user details. This one, right? Yeah. Instead of my app user details, let me rename it as my app user details service. That makes sense, right? So I have to annotate this with that service, then only the instance will be created. Let me restart this. Yeah. Now let me hit that URL, fetch all. Let me try with admin1 and password. See, now I am able to get the fetch all employee details, right? Let me try with fetch one as well. Yeah. Let me log out. Let me log in with. Let me hit the fetch all now. Okay. Log in with user one. Okay. Now user one is also able to access the fetch all. So here we are not relying on the roles. Okay. We are just relying on the authentication, whether the any user can access if the user is already logged in. Okay, any user can access the URL or any microservice. That's what we have done. We have not mentioned any role based authorization because we don't want that in this example. What we want is we want JWT based authorization. So in this example till now what we have covered authenticate microservice using JPA as well, right? Now we are going to implement the enable the JWT capability. Okay, that we will see it. But what is happening now here, right? The moment you invoke any secure microservice, Spring Security is coming into picture and checking whether that URL is authorized, whether the user is authorized or the authenticated or not. If the user is not an authenticated user, it is redirecting user to the default login form and asking the user to sign in. Once the user has provided the username and password, it is making a call or it is comparing what it has fetched from the database. If the both are matching, then it is creating a session in the security, Spring Security, and then only the user will be allowed to access the resource. So basically the user authentication, session management, right? All those things are being done by the Spring Security by providing the default login and logout forms. Okay, but how we can generate, because in JWT based authorization technique we have to generate a JWT token upon successful login, right? But how we can generate if the login is being done by the Spring Security by the default login form, right? So we have to bypass that default login form. We have to provide our own custom authentication or the login endpoint so that once the successful login or the authentication, we can have the hold or the control to generate the token and also create the session based on what based on the details authentication successful or failure. Okay, as the Spring Security is taking care of all these things, we are not bothering about that till now. But as we have to bypass it now for implementing the JWT based authorization, for authentication also we have to take care of it. What Spring Security was doing till now, we have to do it by interacting with the security context holder by putting the data upon successful validation into the security context, so that the other user, upon successful authentication, the user will not be shown with sign in form again and again, right? All those things what Spring Security module is taking care of it, we have to do it now, as we have to bypass the authentication endpoint, right? So let's create an endpoint. Okay, let's create an endpoint login controller. Okay, this is my controller. Instead of login, I'll mention it as authentication controller. Okay, so in this authentication controller, what is, I'll annotate this with at rest controller, and the request mapping is /login, and my method is having public. For now, I'll put it as, and this is my method name login, and this is going to get the data username and password in the post request. So I have to get the data from request body, and I have to get username and password into this object login request. Okay, so let me annotate this with the request mapping as well. So localhost 8080/login/ will come to login. Instead of request mapping, I have to use the post mapping. Okay, so this login request also I have to create it now, right? So let me create login request and also the login response, what I have to authenticate, right? So let me go to, let me create login request as well now. And it will be having only username and password, private string, username, private string, password. Okay, let me generate constructor and setters. Getter and setters as well. Okay, that's all about login request. Now let me generate login response as well. What do we have to respond to client upon successful authentication? We just have to give the JWT token, right? That will be in the string format. Okay, that's all. That is the only field we need. So let's generate the constructor and getter setters. So let me annotate this with the component. This also with component. Yeah, now if I go to authentication controller, this is the authentication controller, right? So we have to do what framework or the security framework would have done if we haven't bypassed the default login form, right? So in Spring Security, Authentication Manager is the one which takes care of all the authentication, right? So we have to have it here, Authentication Manager. Okay, Authentication Manager, and I have to auto-wire it now. Okay, so Authentication Manager, there is a method available, Authentication Manager dot authenticate. Okay, for this one we have to pass authentication instance. Okay, there, as we are dealing with username and password, there is a implementation class of this authentication which is username password authentication token. For this one, we have to pass login request dot get username and get password. So basically, username and password we have to pass to this username password authentication token that authenticates the user. This is actually, if we haven't bypassed the Spring framework, would have done this one security framework. As we are bypassing it, we have to call it now. Okay. If you look at this, there is some error. Let's see that. Okay. So if I'm passing valid credentials, it gives me a valid response or the user is successfully authenticated. But if I'm passing some invalid credentials, then it has to throw me some exception, right? So what is that exception I have to handle? Bad credentials exception I have to handle. Okay. Here I have to throw the exception bad credentials invalid user. With that message I have to throw it now. Here I have to throw the exception. Okay, so this is the authentication technique which we are doing because we are bypassing the default login form. Upon successful validation, what we have to do, we have to generate the token, right? So how we have to generate the token? Because we have to have the header and we have to have the payload, and also we have to have the signature, right? So all these things are required for generating the JWT, right? So the payload means the user details like username or whether the user is active or not. For now, in this example, we will be using only the username as payload and we will encode it. Also, we are going to use some algorithm that we will see it in a second. So we have to generate the token in future for any subsequent client request. We have to authorize the requests. We have to check whether the JWT token is expired or not, whether it is the valid or not. All those things we have to do it right upon JWT. So we will create a class like this. Okay, what is that class I'm going to create? Uh, JWT utils. Okay, this is the class and JWT utils. I'm going to use it. Okay, so there are some predefined, not the predefined, there are some utility methods which we have to use here. Okay, this is the secret which we have to use. Okay, which we have to use while generating the signature, right? So we will go through these methods now. Okay, there is some problem here. Okay, we will see that. Okay, because we have not added, we have not followed our this step, enable JWT capability. How we can add the JWT capability? We have to add pom dependencies in the pom.xml. Okay, what all dependencies we have to add? Because we have to work with JWT generation techniques, right? So there are a couple of libraries available and we are going to use one of the library now. Okay, let me copy this and dependency, right? What is the group ID we are going to use? io.json web token and artifact ID JWT and version also I have to specify. What is the version? 0.9.1. Okay, this is the version. Along with this dependency, I also have to have one more dependency which is a prerequisite, that is JAXB XML dependency. Okay, JAXB.xml.bind and its artifact ID is JWT-API. Its version is 2.3.0. What is the problem here? Missing artifact 2.3.0. JWT-API, JWT.xml, oh, not JWT, JavaX. Okay, so we have added the JWT capabilities to our project now. Now let's try to import. All these errors are gone now, right? So what we are going to do is we have copied these utility methods, right? So we are going to use this create token and the generate token upon successful login, because this create token requires claims. Claims means we will see it in a minute. Here, if you see this, so if you want to pass some user information, that user information we have to pass it as claims here. Okay, and we have to give the subject as username. In this case, our basically subject as the user principal. Okay, the user who is making this transaction, or the user who is coming to the login, or the user who is successfully authenticated. That user details we can make it as subject, set subject. Okay, set issue date, at what time we are issuing this particular token, right? And also we can set the expiration time. See this one, 60 milliseconds, 60,000 milliseconds, which is 60 seconds. 60 seconds into 30 means 1800 seconds. So this token is valid for only 30 minutes, and I'm going to sign that token with this algorithm and with this key. So HS256, SHA-256 is the algorithm I'm going to use, and the secret also we have to mention, right? As we have seen in that JSON JWT.io website, we have to mention the secret as well for generating the signature. So this is my secret here. So here we have to pass the list of claims. So initially I'm passing the claims as empty map, and that claims will be, I mean, the user name, whatever the details I pass, right, they will be added to the claims later on by the security framework. Okay, so generate token is the one which we have to call by passing the user details. So user details, where are we having the user details? Are we having it here in the authentication manager? Yes, we should be having it, right? Upon successful authentication, we have to get the user details again from the database. Here earlier we have developed this my app user details service, right? This method we have not called it. Security framework has called this one, right? So because we have configured this service to be executed by along with the authentication manager, so that's why security framework has called it. But as we are bypassing now the security framework, the authentication process, we have to call that method now from our authentication manager, or the login upon successful login. Okay, now let's call that. So we have to have that user details now. User details service, user details service. I'll annotate that at auto while. Okay, so user details service dot, what is this, my app user details service, right? Okay, my app. So this is user details service. So user details service dot load user by username. Okay, that is the method. For that we have to pass the login request dot get username. So this is the login request, right? So by this one we will be getting the user details, right? The Spring Framework user implementation of the user details will be written from there. That's what we have seen it here. right? This user details we will be getting it. So once we get the user details, we have to generate the token. See, all this is happening only if there is no exception in the authenticate call. These two will be given to the security framework. Once the successful validation, authentication, then only the control comes here. So we have the user details now. So we have to call the method that is available in the JWT utils to generate the token, right? So JWT utils, I have to auto this one as well. Now I have the JWT utils dot generate token. For that I have to pass the user details. So it internally calls the create token, it sets the subject, it sets the claims, and it also uses the SHA-256 algorithm. By it also it all encrypts the data by using the secret that we mentioned in that class, right? So it generates a string JWT token. JWT. That's all. Okay. So we have to return. What we have to return? We have to return the login response, right? So in login response, what we have? We have only the JWT, right? Return new login response of JWT. That's all. Okay. So here we have mentioned we have created one additional endpoint for login as we are bypassing the Spring Security default login form. And upon successful authentication, we are using the user details service and getting the user details and passing that user details to JWT utils, because this is where we are creating a session JWT token by using all the user details and this algorithm and the secret and the expiration time, issue date, everything. Okay, now we are done with this enable JWT capability. We are also done with the generate JWT upon successful login. But are we done with that or not? Let's try it out. Okay, we also have another step, authorize microservices using JWT, that we will see it in a while. Okay, let me restart the application. Here is a problem. Field authentication manager in your missing, right? Consider defining a bean of type authentication manager. So from Spring 2.x onwards, this bean is not being injected directly or not being created directly by the container authentication manager. So we have to create an instance like password encoder, right? We have to create authentication manager bean as well here. Public authentication manager get authentication manager bean return super dot authentication manager bean. We have to annotate with at bean. What is the problem here? Unhandled exception. Let me add throws here. Okay, now let me restart it again. Then we will see if we run into any further issues or not. Yep. See, JWT utils, consider defining a bean, JWT utils. We have created the class, but we have not annotated with the at component. How the container knows? There is no clue, right? We are using it in the authentication controller, but we have not instructed the container to create it as a bean. Now, yep, container started now, right? So now what is the endpoint I have to invoke now? Slash login slash That's all, right? 401 unauthorized error, I'm getting it. Why is that I'm getting 401 unauthorized? Okay. Okay. What is that post mapping, right? I have given the post mapping. So let me give the post mapping as well. So I have to give the body as well, as I mentioned post. So I have to mention the JSON request, right? So what is that I have to pass? I have to pass username. Username is admin1, and password I have to pass as password. Okay. So let's try that now. See, still it is showing 401 unauthorized. Why is that it is showing 401 unauthorized? Because uh, as we have enabled the string security module or the dependencies, every URL will be redirected to default login, right? Even though we have implemented the authentication controller here, we have not instructed container or the Spring Security, don't redirect this URL to the login form. That's why it is again it redirecting the user to the login form. Even that doesn't make sense, right? Login call should not be going to the login form. So we have to bypass that authorization. So how we can bypass it? We have authorization configure method, right? That takes HTTP security, right? In this method, what we have to do in the app security configure method, we have to bypass that, right? So HTTP dot CSRF we have to disable first. Then we have to authorize the requests. How we have to authorize the requests? We have to enable if the URL is having slash login slash. We have to enable it for all users, right? Permit all. Any other URL, any request, we should make it available only for the authenticated users, right? So that is the thing we have to configure as part of authorization. Okay. Now let's try it. Let's try to generate the JWT upon successful authentication. Let's see it. Okay. Now let me try the same URL. See this? With the same username and the same request, we are successfully able to generate the JWT, right? So we are done with this part. Generate JWT upon successful login. Now we have to implement the last and final step, authorize microservices using JWT, right? So for each subsequent request, we have to get the authorization, right? We have to get the JWT token from the authorization and validate it whether this request is authorized to invoke that, whether the user is authorized to invoke that particular request or not. Okay, now let's do that. Okay, so for each subsequent request we have to intercept the request, right? We have to stop the request and do this kind of validation. So what we have to do is we have to do some kind of authorization before the actual resource, before the request is reaching the actual resource, right? Actual microservice. So what we have to do is we have to create a filter now for authorizing it for every request, right? So let me create authorization filter. Okay, and this will be extended from extends from once per request filter. Okay, which means that For every request, this filter will be executed only once. Okay, there is an unimplemented method do filter internal that we have to override for validating the token now. Okay, so what we have to do here, we have to validate the token. So validate token is a method that is present in our JWT utils. What it will do, it will check whether the token is expired or not, whether also whether the username present in the token is equal to the username that we received from the database or not. Okay, so let's check that now. Here validate token is there, extract, it is going to take the username. The moment you call the username, extract claim, it is going to call, extract all claims. Extract all claims is going to call, it is actually going to parse your JWS. Okay, so if you go to that method, okay, let me go to that implementation. See this is calling a parse method. Let me go to that. See, this is again calling a parse method here. See, all the JWT based comparisons are being done here. So if you at all your uh, if at all any malicious user modifies the payload or the header, then that will be validated here, because we are going to take out the server is going to take out the header and the payload part from the whole JWT, and it is going to generate a, see this base64 URL encoder header and the base64 URL encoder payload. They will be generated, the signature will be generated for them now, and they will be compared with the signature what we received in the request. If they are not matching, then this will be thrown. JWT signature does not match locally computed generated signature. So that's how the first step of the validation happen whenever you try to validate the token. Upon successful validation of that inbuilt JSON parsing, then only your validation works, whether the token is expired or not, whether the username you are getting from the token is same as what you received from the database. All those things will be checked. Okay, so that check we have to initiate it from the authorization filter, which is implemented from the request per once per request filter. So as per the standard JWT specification, client has to send the header authorization header, okay, that contains this bearer token or the JWT token that is prefixed with bearer. Okay, so we have to get request dot get header of authorization. If it is there, then only we have to proceed further. Okay, string authorization header value. Okay, now if authorization header value is not equal to null, and there is and it started with, sorry, it started with bearer string, right? Authorization header value dot starts with bearer token, bearer string. So this is how the user has to send, the client has to send the JWT token once they receive the JWT from the login response. It has to start with bearer space and its header name should be authorization. So once we have it, we have to get its value, right? Authorization header value dot substring. We have to exclude that bearer string. We have to start from the after the bearer. Bearer is having some 6 characters and we have to give 7 for space, right? So this will be having the JWT that is coming from the client to server. So let's create a JWT local variable here. So JWT is fine now. What we have to get now, we have to get the extract the username from the JWT, right? So JWT utils dot. Okay, we need JWT utils as well, right? JWT utils, JWT utils at AutoWire. Okay, JWT utils dot extract username. Username, from this token we have to get the username, right? So this extract username, we have seen it, right? Extract claim will pass the JSON, all the validation happens, and we will get the username at the end. So we will store it in the username variable. String username is this. Okay, once we have the username, we have to get the user details from the database, right? If username is not equal to null, then we have to get the user details from the database. How we can get the user details from the database? Using user details service. Where is our user details service? We have to automate it, right? My app user details service, that is extended from the user details service, right? At AutoWire. So this dot user details service dot load user by username. We have to get it by username. We will get the user details, right? So once we get the user details, we have to validate it, right? So how are we going to validate it? There is a method available in JWT utils which we have seen some time back. Verify token or validate token. Yeah, validate token, we have to pass the whole token and also the user details, right? So validate token, we have to pass the JWT and the user details that we extracted from the database. So if it returns true, then only we have to do something. What we have to do something? Because as we are bypassing the string security default login flow, right? If we would have not bypassed it, Spring Security would have maintained the session, would have created the principal in the Spring Security context, right? All those things we have to do it now. Okay, so as we are using username password based authentication, right? Let's use the same thing, new username password authentication token. This accepts the user details. What is the user details? And we don't have to pass the password, and we also have to pass the roles or authorities. Okay, this generates username password authentication token. Okay, that is an authentication instance. So once we have the authentication, we have to set authentication dot details, set details, whatever details we have received from that request, right? Because we should not be losing all other details in the next component that is going to run after this filter, right? What is that component? Your controller should not be losing any other data, right? So we have to pass all the request data that is coming into this authentication, into this authentication. So there is a method web authentication details source and build details. To that we have to pass the request. So again here, along with username not equal to null, right? We also have to check whether there is no other user information in the current security context in the Spring Frame security. Okay, that we have to check like this. Okay, security context holder Okay, security holder dot get context dot get authentication is equal to null. Then only go into it to set the user into the context. So how we can set the user into the context? Like this. Once we have the username password authentication token object, we have to set it into the context like the security context folder dot get context dot set authentication. That authentication we have to pass it username or password. This is a implementation class of the authentication, right? We know it, we have used it in the login. Here we have used it, right? Authentication controller username password based authentication, this one. Whatever the object we are passing for authenticate, the same object we have to pass to set in the security context as well. Once that is completed, what we have to do, we have to pass the filter to the next controller. Chain dot filter chain dot do filter of request response. So that is how we are authorizing the requests here. This validate token will check for the expiry and also the user details that we extracted from the token and the username we got from the database, whether they both are same or not, that will be checked. The inbuilt validation as part of the JSON web token parsing, we have seen it. It is going to validate by generating the signature for both payload and header, and it compares with the signature that is coming in the request. Once they are matched, then only the control comes into your custom code. Okay, so once all the validations are completed, we are going to set the user, the authorized user, as the incoming user as an authorized user into the security context. So once this filter execution is completed, we will the control will be given to the controller. What is the controller? Whatever the resource the user is trying to access, that particular controller will be executed. So along with that, we have to annotate this class with that component. Okay, so that's all. There is one last thing which we have to do. Okay, we have done the authorization as well, right? But as we are maintaining JWT as a stateless, and we should not, I mean, we should instruct the Spring security, don't maintain any sessions for the Spring security for the users. Okay, that we have to maintain it here, that we have to instruct it here. Okay, don't we have to instruct the Spring security so that it will not maintain any sessions. Okay, so how we can instruct here? There is a method available, session management dot session management creation policy. Yeah, session management dot session creation policy as stateless. Okay, once that is done, so Spring Security is not going to maintain any sessions now for the incoming users. Along with that, whatever the filter we have written, right? This authorization filter we have written. So we should configure this to be executed before the username password authentication filter. Okay, so how we can mention it using like this. Okay, http. Okay, we have to stop it here. There is a method http dot add filter before. Here we have to mention a filter which should be executed before the filter that is mentioned in the second argument. So authorization filter that should be executed right before the username password authentication filter. This is a default filter. Okay, filter class. Before that, we want our filter to be executed. What is our filter? Our authorization filter. I'll auto it now. So authorization filter. Okay. So we have instructed the container the Spring Security don't maintain any sessions. It should be always the stateless as I am going to take over the session creation or the authorization technique. Okay. And we are also mentioned about the authorization filter that it has to be executed before the username password authentication filter. Okay, whatever we are done using the filter here, this will be executed before any microservice request. Okay, now let's try to run this one and let me, yeah, server started successfully. Now let me log in. So this has created a JWT token, right? Let me copy this and hit now the employee fetch all service localhost colon 8080 slash employees slash fetch all. This is a get service, right? So let me hit it now. It is saying 403 forbidden because we mentioned all the URLs should be for only authenticated users. So we have to mention the JWT authorization header, right? In the authorization header, what is that authorization header? I have to use this, and as per the standard I have to give the bearer space and I have to mention the token which I received from the login request. Now let me hit this. See, now we are getting it now, right? So whatever the URL, whatever the JSON web token you received from the login, and that we are giving in the next subsequent requests, and that is being validated by using your authorization filter. If at all it is valid, then only it is trying to give the response for that resource. Let me hit this service now, fetch by ID. See, this is also working fine because we have the authorization. Suppose let me not send this bearer token authorization JWT, then what it is say? It is saying 403 forbidden. So it is not maintaining any state. Further, it is maintaining the authorization based on this authorization header, the JWT, which it was receiving from the client, which was actually given to the client during the authentication successful response. Suppose if I change the request, right? See, suppose if I uh, change something in the payload, okay, what it will happen, we will see. See, I have removed some character, right? Now let me see what it happens. See, 403 forbidden error. Even though I am passing authorization, but I am passing some other uh, authorization, some other JWT token. So it is giving me some error. What is that error? We will see it. See this, the JWT signature does not match locally computed signature. JWT validity cannot be accepted and should not be trusted because we modified or we have given some illegal or the malicious payload, right? It is checking. We have seen that in the code, right? In the framework code, we have seen that how the validations are being done by taking out the payload and header, right? All those things we have seen it. So that is how it is validating first. It is not going to accept any malicious or the illegal or the invalid payloads or the invalid signature because it is always trying to compare with what it has received in the signature, and it is also by comparing it with the generated one with the received payload and header. That is how it is going to secure or protect your microservices. Suppose if there is another scenario, okay, this all these things so we have discussed till now are very good examples for authorizing your microservices, and it is stopping the microservices invocation if the illegal payload or the illegal web token is coming up or the malicious web token is coming up. Suppose if there are two users, one user is successfully authenticated and given server given the JWT token, but malicious user somehow extracted the JWT token of that user and user to the malicious user making another call by using the actual JWT token of the other user, first user. Then the server won't be able to find out because this is a I mean, this is a valid request. There is no problem with the computed signature and the signature. The only problem is with the input. The malicious user somehow got the uh, genuine users JWT token. So server won't be able to find out whether it is coming from the genuine user or the malicious user. Server will be able to find out only whether the request is valid or malicious by comparing the computer signature and the actual signature. So in such cases, the request will be passed through. The malicious user will be able to see your user data, the genuine user's data. So to avoid those problems, we have to find out some other ways so that it won't be the extracted to malicious users. The JSON web tokens of one users will not be exposed to other users or will not be hacked by other users. So in order to support, there are a couple of techniques. One of the technique is wrapping or using the OAuth based technique while giving the JWT token to clients. So that we will see it in the future videos. So in today's video, we have seen in detail about the authentication using the GPA and we have enabled the project with JWT authorization. We have generated the JWT upon successful login. We have authorized the subsequent requests only if the proper JWT is there, only if the legal JWT, legitimate JWT is there, then only the user is allowed to access the particular endpoint resource. All of the malicious requests are stopped by the authorization filter which we have written, and that is executing for each request that is coming to your microservice. Okay, that's all we have seen today in detail with the live example. Thank you for watching. Please give it a like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.